Thanks, Lindell, and I have the benefit of having heard Mark and Frank's comments, so I'll try and fill in some of the remaining gaps. I've sort of organised comments around what to expect, what might count as success, what particularly is important to pay attention to from an Australian context, and some of the sticking points. So I think both Mark and Frank have pointed to the importance of the context here in terms of setting the scope of expectations, and the expectations are modest because of that context. This COP is not going to be the high profile type meeting that we had last year in Glasgow, because it's sitting in between that Glasgow meeting, which was deliberately trying to raise ambition, and next year's COP, where we'll be seeing, as Mark mentioned, this global stocktake process, which will be looking at how much progress we're making through national pledges and action towards the climate goals. That's why it's been called things like the implementation COP or the waypoint COP. The idea, if you like, football analogies, is that there's certain plays that are going to be made, the ball taken up the field, but not expecting to have any major things scored in this particular COP. It's more preparatory for future meetings. That said, though, the fact that this COP is being held on the African continent, that Egypt is the host, is really an opportunity for developing country voices, and particularly those of the least developed countries, to come to the fore. Frank mentioned that there are very significant geopolitical headwinds facing this COP, but it always seems to be, in the context of these meetings, that there's a bit of a roller coaster ride of political events going into any COP, and this one seems to be no exception. So certainly the Ukraine invasion and then energy crisis are big cold winds blowing against the possibility of ambition, but we're also seeing results, some green shoots of hope, you might say, from, for example, the recent Brazilian elections, where we've seen the Bolsonaro administration removed in favour of the Lulu administration. That's at least promising more progress on reducing deforestation in the Amazon. Frank mentioned the medium-term outlook on renewable energy installation and energy transition. That's really been reaffirmed in the last week by the World Energy Outlook produced by the International Energy Agency. And we've also seen some big legislative developments this year, not least in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, which doesn't sound like a piece of climate legislation, but in fact is really a raft of economic incentives and tax measures that are being put in place by the US government that will really drive the energy transition in that country. So that's very positive, and to a large degree Congress proof, regardless of the results of the November midterm elections. So in that context, what counts as success? It needs to be moderated in light of the expectations that this is not going to be a high-profile COP. But there are some important things on the agenda, particularly for that grouping of developing countries. And the loss and damage issue, which has been around in the UN climate negotiations since the beginning, but really hasn't had a lot of prominence, is suddenly coming to much more prominence this year. So part of that is because we've had so many climate-related disasters occurring across the world this year. So it's very much front of many countries' minds, the costs associated with climate change, and the important question of who's going to pay for those dealing with that damage. So credible progress on that issue, I think, is going to be seen by many developing countries in particular as a litmus test for success of this COP, as well as the broader issues around finance, money moving from developed countries to developing countries to support their transition. Australia is going to be a very different actor this time around, it's clear. Not only are we taking, obviously, an updated nationally determined commitment, our new emissions reduction targets to this COP. But that's also producing higher expectations of what Australia might do at the COP as a negotiating party. So certainly there's an expectation that it's going to be a more constructive partner in the negotiations than it has before. And there's been a lot of talk from the Australian government about particularly wanting to elevate the voices of our Pacific neighbours as part of that sort of reset of its approach to negotiations. So even though it's an African COP and we'll hear a lot about issues on the African continent, expect to see the Australian government also pushing to elevate Pacific voices, which is of course part of its broader climate change and security agenda. The Australian Pavilion, which is the sort of hub for Australian activity at the COP, will also have a very different look and feel. For those who were at the COP last year, might remember that it had a very big presentation from energy company Santos as part of the pavilion. This year, it's going to feature digital artworks from First Nations artists. So the contrast, I think, speaks loudly. We're also hoping or expecting that there might be some kind of announcement from the Australian government about its plans or its desire to host a COP, COP29 in 2024. So the Australian government or the Albanese government announced this as an election, promised that they would seek to host a COP in Australia. Next year's COP is in the United Arab Emirates. So it's not going to be that one. The next one that could come up is in 2024. So there is furious lobbying going on at the moment with Pacific nations, with other nations, to see if Australia could host that COP in conjunction with our Pacific partners as early as 2024. So we might expect to see something about that. And finally, what are the sticking points going to be? Well, because this COP is about delivery, the sticking points are probably going to be about money, finance in COP terms. So who's providing it, how much, to whom, for what, and how it's going to be delivered. There are all kinds of questions around finance that are unresolved and need to be progressed. There's pledges that developed countries made as far back as 2009 to be mobilising $100 billion a year in finance by 2020 that still haven't been met. There's a new finance goal to agree, and of course the question of loss and damage. If there's going to be some sort of mechanism set up to pay for those kinds of costs associated with climate disasters in developing countries. And this really brings to the fore the issue of climate justice, which is really points up the fact that in climate, those countries that have contributed least to the problem are suffering the most. So if there's not progress on these kinds of issues, then it really brings into frame, are we charting a pathway to a just and sustainable world? I'll just finish with one other comment, which is that COPs go on for 2 weeks every single year. They are a good focal point for thinking about what the world is doing on climate, but they're not the be-all and end-all. Increasingly, a lot of what's happening on climate is not happening in the COPs. And in fact, as Frank pointed to, there are many other options for countries to mobilise around climate, which might be climate clubs, smaller groupings of countries taking forward action in higher ambition coalitions. Other international institutions moving in this space, particularly our international financial institutions. And of course, beyond the COP, in terms of civil society, First Nations and business organisations, we're seeing a lot of activity that will also be going on the sidelines of this COP. And in many cases, that's making a lot more progress than you might see in the very incremental negotiations between governments. So I'll stop there, Lyndall. Thanks very much.